you didn't show up and you didn't do everything with all your grit and all your might, every sinew and muscle in your body, like to just survive, you know what I mean? As an entrepreneur, it would be perilous. We wouldn't make it. Like, it is a very high contact sport, and it requires everything of you. It's a very humbling, refining process, right? This entrepreneurship. But I love that your podcast is about hope, because that is the one thing you absolutely must have as an entrepreneur. You must truly have hope and believe that all that energy, that all of that sweat, blood, and tears is worth it, that it will realize some return in your life. And whether it's financial or emotional or through impact, in my case, it was about the impact for mankind socially, for the social good. But you know, it's very, very important that you have that hope.
If you've listened to the Hope Strategy podcast for a while, or if you're new around here, there's a good chance you've heard us mention MWI, which is Josh and I's digital marketing agency. None of the Hope Strategy podcasts would be possible without MWI. And I would like to offer a free 20-minute consultation to anybody that listens to the podcast that's looking for some digital marketing help. Just go to mwi.com/hope strategy and sign up, and we'll reach out to you, and you will get a free 20-minute consultation with yours truly to talk about your digital marketing needs, to talk about your website, whatever questions you have. I'm happy to answer them. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy podcast. Please reach out. I'd love to help you with your marketing. Welcome to a new episode of the Hope Strategy podcast, here with Josh Steimley. As always, I am Corey Blake, and we had an amazing conversation today with Lindsay Hadley, who we didn't know, but Josh already knew and had worked with a little bit and had networked with her. I don't know what your relationship, but have you done any projects with her in the past, or you just know her through some connections you have?
Through some connections, helped her out with some PR work once upon a time.
Cool. So yeah, it was a serendipitous thing that Josh already knew, or we had an amazing conversation. So as far as bios go, Lindsay Hadley has become one of the most sought after consultants and producers in the nonprofit sector. Early in her career, she facilitated humanitarian projects in Kenya, Peru, Mexico, and Thailand. Since then, she has demonstrated her exceptional fundraising skills, raising more than $35 million directly for her clients, and has leveraged billions for causes through her campaigns and events. She's a founding member and chief development officer and executive producer of Global Citizen, a name that probably a lot of people have heard, especially in the last year. They've been really busy. The End of Polio concert in Perth, Australia, and the Global Citizen Festival in Central Park 2 years in a row. She produced those. The Global Citizen Festival has featured the world's biggest music acts, Hollywood actors, and countless world leaders. The festival secured a live audience of more than 60,000 and leveraged 1.3 billion in new funding commitments and reached more than 3 billion people worldwide. These are all big numbers we're talking about. These are B's, not M's, M's would be impressive enough. She now has her own personal consult. She still does all this other stuff, but now she has a consulting firm called Hadley Impact Consulting, where she works specifically. Let's see here. Hadley Impact Consulting worked on the first ever social impact fund, partnered with the Vatican, called the Laudato Si Challenge. Lindsay is a founding partner of the LSC and executively produced the first ever demo day at the Vatican. I'm just going to, she's done so much stuff. Literally worked with everybody from Kenneth Cole to the Pope to Beyonce to every, Neil Young and the Foo Fighters and whatever. She's behind the scenes for the past 10 or 15 years of some of the biggest charity fundraising events for some of the biggest causes in the world. It's pretty remarkable what her impact has been.
Yep. When you hear the first story, you'll be amazed, but don't stop there, because she's got great stuff that comes after her first story about Larry King.
Yeah, it was really timely because, man, I love Larry King and I've always been a huge fan of his, and he passed away this past week. And then as I was doing my research in our conversation, I saw that she knew him, and I heard some of the stories of how he had helped her early in her career in this whole thing. And yeah, that was really powerful. And then, yeah, it just kept going. Again, another one of these conversations we could have had for 5 hours and we'd still be going. So, really enjoyed the conversation. She's made a huge impact. She has a great insight into the world of fundraising and charity, the ins and outs of it, and also some really good advice to anybody that listens on where and how they can find hope and causes that they can get behind and all of that. So please enjoy this episode of the Hope Strategy podcast with Lindsay Hadley.
Something is happening in our world.
Time is very precious.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
Hope in the face of difficulty.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Hope in the face of uncertainty.
I'm better now than I was. I'm experienced now.
Changing the world can happen anywhere, and anyone can do it.
The audacity of hope.
This is the Hope Strategy Podcast with Corey Blake and Josh Steinley.
So I want to start off, we'll kind of get into the meat of this a little bit. I want to first off, this past week, Larry King passed away. And that's an interesting transition, I know, but I've been fascinated with Larry King pretty much my whole life. I remember growing up, my dad watched him a lot. Always the CNN, Larry King, like always was watching him. I remember some really important people to me early in my life were interviewed by him. And then as I've gotten older, and I've just always had this like obsession, like what my pastime has been to watch interviews. I've loved it. And he's obviously the, pun intended, I guess, the king of the hill, right? When it comes to interviewers and amazing conversationalists and stuff. But you had a more personal relationship with him. And as I was doing research, I watched, I watched some videos where you talked to him and where you were interviewed by him on an online show that he was doing and stuff. But you had a pretty personal relationship and personal experience with him. So I wanted, before we even jump into other things, I wanted to ask you about that and maybe give you a second to talk about that relationship. And then, what Larry King specifically meant to you and your career as you were getting things going.
Oh, thanks, Corey, for a chance to do that. It's a tender time for his beautiful family, especially. I mean, it was surprising how, because he's so much older, there's some kind of an emotional cognition that's like, okay, like this is a part of life. Like older people die, like we don't live forever. Like there's something that prepares you for that. And he hadn't been well. He'd been sick, and he'd had a couple of really scary incidences over the last year where we thought that he might die. I mean, he just was really resilient. And, I stay in contact and speak regularly with his stepson, Danny Southwick, who's Sean Southwick's son from her first marriage. He's a dear friend. I just cherish Danny and his wife, Tilly. They're amazing people. And so I've been keeping tabs on him a bit. And so when it came, I was surprised at how much I felt this loss this morning, because I thought there was so much preparation in my mind for it or whatever. And I had it just these flood of emotions and feelings of how much gratitude I felt for him, that over my career, I realized, the amalgamation of all of these different ways he helped me and supported these charitable initiatives that I've been working on, kind of just the impact of it came into full effect for me in a way that just made me feel so tender and so grateful. And it's been so beautiful to see people cherishing him and honoring him, and, other high profile people, celebrities, other people have big platforms, and just understanding what an impact his life had on so many people. But I'm so grateful, because my first interaction with him actually came in like a dark moment, like in terms of for me, like a desperate moment as an entrepreneur and as a person pursuing dreams to make a difference in the world for good. It was the first year of the Global Citizen Festival, which, just as a quick segue into there, is a big music festival that I executive produced and was a founding member of, as one of the early team members, as the chief development officer of this organization called Global Citizen. And there were 4 executives at the time, myself and 3 young guys, and I was, married with kids. Being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I had, got married really young and had kids really young. The rest of these guys were, just previously out of college or whatever. And I essentially was, really the one responsible for like making the festival happen, in terms of it was myself and Hugh Evans, the co-founder and CEO, who were responsible for finding the music artists and the money. And those were the 2, predominant kind of difficult impossibilities that we were facing. And we had raised $6 million of the $7 million it was going to take to put on this festival in Central Park. And that, by the way, that's without paying any of the music artists anything, their normal music fees. It was, them volunteering their time, but you had to shut down like a third of NYPD and like the production and the team and the staff and the campaign. I mean, it's just such an expensive ordeal to do what we did there and what they still do at Global Citizen today. But we had a major a company, a major bank actually had agreed to be the title sponsor of the event. And we had a red line contract going back and forth to like close that. And we had a verbal commitment from their global CMO. And they had in the like week before we were announcing this festival to the world, which was just a few months before the festival would take place in September during the United Nations General Assembly meeting in Central Park. This CMO was fired, and then the company reversed her decision to sponsor us. It just left it like rug tricked us. Yeah. So suddenly we're $1 million short, but like it was everything short, it might as well have been $7 million short kind of thing, because we just like couldn't go forward. And we had these incredible artists lined up, the Foo Fighters and Band of Horses and all these great artists, Black Keys, and Neil Young. Like it was just going to be this legendary thing. And people, it was truly historic. Like people are not able to put music festivals on in Central Park for a myriad of reasons. It's very rare when they have. I mean, we all know the famous Simon and Garfunkel, a couple other bands have done it over time, but the reason why is Central Park makes you give away the tickets and through a lottery system. It's in their bylaws. You can't sell tickets. And so touring bands and normal acts and normal producers can't really put on this event because it's not financially equitable. Mm-hmm. So you have to like give it away. So we had to rely upon generous sponsors and benefactors who would underwrite these tickets. And it worked great for the Global Citizen model because our model was gamifying engagement for advocacy for ending extreme poverty. People would earn their tickets by taking actions on globalcitizen.org, and we would give them through a lottery. They'd win the tickets based on points. They had more entries. So like our model, it was conducive for, but what we were trying to do in that year, 2012, was truly historic. I'm confident that the venue was one of the major reasons we got Neil Young and the Foo Fighters, was because it was a bucket list thing for them to perform in Central Park. They had never done it. Someone like Neil Young had never performed there, and Stevie Wonder and these other artists we later secured. So here we were, like, it looked like it was all for naught. It looked like it was, our names are going to become mud. It looked like everything we've worked for a year, was just going to be destroyed. And it was a pretty, desperate situation. And I was living at the time in Queensland, Australia, with my husband and my 2 little boys at the time. I now have 3 children. But at the time, I literally just went through my phone and my social media and was like, who do I know that knows someone who could help us find $1 million in 1 week? Because we had 1 week, our board told us, if you can find $1 million this week, you can proceed. If not, it's all over. And it was just, you can imagine, like, what if I told you tomorrow, you got to find $1 million in donation, by the way. Yeah, totally. So I was going through my social media, my Facebook at the time, and I saw Tilly Sign, who is now Tilly Southwick, who I played soccer with like 10 years before at East High School. And, I hadn't talked to her outside of like social media likes on or whatever in that time frame. And she was just a lot younger than me in school, only 2 years younger, but in high school, that's like a world apart,
Yeah.
And she was just darling. And I always really liked her. And she was
Larry King's stepdaughter?
Stepdaughter. Yeah. She had married Danny Southwick. Yeah. Sean Southwick's daughter-in-law. And so I remembered that. I'd heard somewhere that she'd married Larry King's stepson. And so I was like, maybe Larry King's such a legend. Maybe we could, have a dinner hosted at his home. And that way I can bring a bunch of like billionaires and centimillionaires around the table. And then I could just pitch them all for this last $1 million. Like if we can make it kind of special where they're getting invited. And this was like my harebrained idea, to come up with this in the last minute. So like to literally be asking him, can you host a dinner at your home like this week, and I shamelessly called Tilly because of just my sheer need, and was like, look, I'm so sorry. Like, I hate being this guy because like you're, I'm sure people try to get to Larry all the time through you. And like, this is such a desperate situation, but I really feel this is such a gift to humanity. Can I tell you what I'm working on? I think it'll affect the lives of, millions of people living in extreme poverty. And let me tell you what our vision is and what we're trying to accomplish. And she was like, this is amazing. Like let me connect you to Danny, my husband. And then I talked to Danny. Danny was like, yeah, let me set up a call with Larry. The next day I'm on the phone call with Larry King. And I was so intimidated, you guys, like just because what I was asking was just a lot, pulling a ton of social capital. And it was just kind of audacious as heck. And so like I get on the phone and Larry's everything you'd think he'd be, it's like a Jewish media mogul interviewer that's older gentleman, from his era. Like he was just so straight to the point. It was so intimidating. He got on the phone and he was like, this is Larry, and I was like, hi, Mr. King, like trying to start with small talk. He's, what do you want? Just get right to it, kid. It's like what he says to me, and I'm like, I start to tell him like, okay, well, we put together this thing, and I start to tell him about the concert, and he keeps wanting me to be quicker, more concise. Like he literally is like, just cut to the chase. What are you asking me for? Like, But it was so disarming because I was like, I thought I had to give this whole pitch and explain, but he was just so efficient, and he just wanted to understand. And he was like, just tell me exactly what you need. And then I tell him, I'm like, I need you to do a dinner at your house. I'm going to invite some billionaires. And if you can invite any high net worth friends, and we're going to save this thing. And he was just like, all right, deal. Like, let's do it, which was so generous of him, and just, he didn't even know me. Like, this was just unbelievable. So I fly from Australia to LA, literally jet lagged, and come to his house. He had Wolfgang Puck come cater the dinner. It was like this amazing, beautiful home in Beverly Hills, literally like as I pulled up early in the day before there was like a Hollywood tour bus driving by the home, pointing at his home. And this is where the great Larry King lives, like it was just like out of a movie, the whole thing. And I come into his house, and his beautiful wife, Sean, who's now a dear friend, like, they were so gracious with me, and we bring all these guests, and you guys, it was just such a stressful thing. We brought all of these hundred people around the table, and it was, we could only fit, six guests, and because they had a +1, right? So it was this table of 12, dinner with the Kings, and Hugh Evans and I just got up, and Hugh tells me right before the dinner, he goes, Lindsay, I'm going to tell them the story of like what we're trying to build to end extreme poverty and starting Global Citizen, and my story of how I got involved in this. And then you're going to ask everyone for money. I'm like, oh, great. Thanks. So like basically that's what happened, is just like, he gets up, tells this inspiring story, sits down, and then I get up and I'm like, and we need $1 million right now. Like it was just, I mean, it was not that crass, but pretty much it was pretty close to that, and I'm sure Larry was just mortified, like the whole thing. And there's just crickets, it was just like so stressful. But anyway, ultimately we did have 2 donors there be like, I'll come in for, one came in for 150,000. Another one said, I'll do 250. Right. So we raised 400,000, and we were just like dismal failures, like, cause we had to come up with $1 million. Yeah. And so it was like, I remember being despondent the whole night. I couldn't even think. And driving home from that event, Hugh Evans, it was literally like in tears. And we were just like, what are we going to do? And Sumner Redstone, the chairman of Viacom, had been at the dinner. We invited him because he'd already given $1.5 million the year before for our End of Polio concert, which was a huge success. And now he'd given another 1.5. So he's $3 million into this. On the ride home, I said to Hugh, what if we went back to Sumner? Like, I don't think he wants us to fall over for the lack of like $600,000. Right. So like the next morning we spoke to this amazing friend named Malia, who had introduced us to Sumner, and asked if it would be appropriate and okay. And she was very generous and was like just such a team player making this all happen. So the next morning we had Hugh call Sumner, asked him, he said yes. And literally like it was LA time, Pacific Standard, and our board 9 a.m. So I think we spoke to him at 7 a.m. And it was, 3 hours, 10 a.m. It was an hour into the New York business day. And our board members are like, guys, did you raise $1 million? Yes or no? And we're ignoring the board members, texting us and emailing us, because we were trying to have this conversation with Sumner Redstone, who also just generously said, yes, I'll cover the last amount, and allowed us to move forward. And that was on a Saturday or a Sunday, because we had the event on Saturday. So it was Monday morning that we launched, announced to the world our festival, and it was just this miracle. So ultimately, Larry saved the Global Citizen Festival and his family. And if it weren't for them, it would not have ever happened, which it went on to leverage 1.4 billion, 1.2 that first year, $1.2 billion for the world's poor. And became like the largest charity syndication, I think, in history. Global Citizen now is just massive. I mean, it's basically like the UN PR engine, and millions and millions and millions of actions have been taken on behalf of the poor, and billions of dollars have been pledged as a result of that platform being created. And so that was my kind of introduction to him. And then after that, like whether it was doing PSAs for something I did with Imagine Dragons, a campaign, or whether it was, doing interviews with Kevin Bacon for me, who, we were helping his charity, 6degrees.org, or whether it was even being a keynote speaker at a gala that we put together. He just over and over generously showed up for these causes, and his family was just endlessly supportive of us. And I just feel so grateful. So what a great legacy in life, that he had. And, I think it's really, it's a real testament to him to see how many people in the industry were just really touched by, the impact he had on them. So thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate you taking that time.
Yeah. I appreciate you giving us all that detail. I mean, that's incredible, especially when you look at that you said that was 2012. So 9 years ago, and the growth that Global Citizen has seen since then, and all of the other opportunities that you've had and that your team has had, and, whatever, whether it's personally or as a business or as a team or whatever. I love that he's probably been pitched so many things. And so he's like, get to the point. What are you doing? I've had thousands of people ask me for money, ask me for my time. Like, what do you want? And for him to make that sacrifice a week in advance and do that's huge. That's so cool. So rest in peace, Larry King, man. He definitely left an impact that most will not. So
absolutely. Yeah, for sure. A real legend, as it were.
Yeah. So
what an amazing story, Lindsay. And the crazy thing is, knowing a little bit about you, I know this is just one out of like 50 stories that you can tell. That's what has me excited for the rest of this interview here. Is we could end it right there with that one, but I know there's so much more.
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, desperate times call for desperate measures. But one of the things that has taught me is, and I think every entrepreneur who's ever built anything, both you gentlemen with your company, your agency, and all the endeavors you've done, you just know that like there are so many moments where these like do or die, these things, that the trajectories of like the sliding doors of like if you didn't show up and you didn't do everything with all your grit and all your might, every sinew and muscle in your body, like to just survive, you know what I mean, as an entrepreneur, it would be perilous. We wouldn't make it. Like, it is a very high contact sport, and it requires everything of you. And I think sometimes people look at successes like Global Citizen, it's been a great success. And people look at it and they just kind of, when you came out of nowhere, you guys just were successful overnight. It's like, it's a lifetime and a career of, failures and ideations and disappointments and following up short, disappointing people, which is the one that kills me the most, and you continue to, right? Like when you go from that and go to the next thing, you take some of the lessons you learned, but then you're in new situations, new circumstances, and you just get, it's a very humbling, refining process, right? This entrepreneurship. But I love that your podcast is about hope, because that is the one thing you absolutely must have as an entrepreneur. You must truly have hope and believe that that all that energy, that all of that sweat, blood, and tears is worth it, that it will realize some return in your life. And whether it's financial or emotional or through impact, in my case, it was about the impact for mankind socially, for the social good. But it's very, very important that you have that hope.
Yeah. And as we're continuing to talk to more and more people, and as I studied anthropology in school, and I just tend to be very interested in what makes people tick and, why they do what they do. But specifically with I don't want to narrow it down to just entrepreneurs, but obviously that's a good example. But also we've talked to academics, we've talked to religious leaders, we've talked to entrepreneurs, we've talked to, whatever, from small businesses to huge corporations, whatever. I'm constantly trying to understand what is that extra gear that some people just have that end up making things happen. And like you said, it is easy to see Global Citizen today and say, man, where'd you guys come from? And you're saying, well, you should have seen the first year or the first two or the first office that we had or whatever. And when we were talking to Guy Kawasaki a week or two ago, he, having been around entrepreneurship and big money investments and stuff his whole life in Silicon Valley and stuff, he was talking, he that's how he put it, was grit. Like it's just this grit. And so that was actually one of my questions I was going to ask you is, and you've already answered it, so I'm not even going to go to it, but just wondering, like, what are the ins and outs of fundraising and some of the grit? And that's a perfect example, that Larry King example. And like Josh said, I'm sure you have 100 other ones where it's like a lot of people would have said, there is no way to get $1 million in the next week. And it's not like we haven't tried. We've been at this for a long time and we've got 6 million and now we have, like it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. But to get on like that extra gear, that grit is to say, well, you know what, before I call it, I'm going to go get on Facebook and I'm just going to see if I can throw out a Hail Mary somewhere. Like, do I know anybody that might know somebody? Like, I love that you did that. And then it's like, oh yeah, next thing you know, a week later, I'm flying to LA and having dinner with Larry King and a bunch of billionaires. Like that's fantastic.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I don't know how much applause it needs, when, like I said, you're desperate, but no, I think there is something of like, I'm not going to go down without a fight. You know what I mean? It's like, I will do everything. Yeah. I think there is something to be said about that for sure. And I think it just matters how much you care, about things. And there were so many people that helped, whether it was like Malia that I mentioned, Danny, you know what I mean? These little angels that come in when they see you fighting for your life. Humans are so beautifully empathic and good by nature is what I believe. Yeah,
I'm with you there. So Global Citizen at the beginning in its infancy it's evolved a lot. Like you said, it's basically kind of like the charity or fundraising arm of the UN, right? Is that what you said? So, but at the beginning, it was
like the advocacy.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that bit. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, but at the beginning, it was like, we want to end world hunger. Right. And I even saw in one of and correct me if I'm wrong, but I even saw in one of the interviews where Larry King was like, I didn't believe it was possible. Like that was his gut reaction, was like, I liked the idea. I didn't think it was possible, but I figured I'd give you a shot type thing, like that's such a big ask or a big task at hand. How did that start? Where did that come from? Why did you do it? How did you how did you find partners? I mean, the whole, like, what is the infancy of Global Citizen at the very beginning and why did it start?
So it was actually ending extreme poverty, which hunger fits under.
Sorry, poverty, yeah.
No, you're fine. No, but as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, that is one of the major focuses, is food insecurity. And poverty was something, I mean, for Global Citizen, it was a group of young people, mostly from Australia. I think there's a handful of us as well from the US, but it was this little tiny group of compassionate social do-gooders that really believed in this vision that you actually could end extreme poverty. There at the time when it was started, I think the numbers have been really interestingly impacted due to COVID and the economic downturn, which set us back on the goals to end extreme poverty probably by a decade, tragically. But before this pandemic and this economic impact, we've seen like historic lows for people living on abject poverty, which is defined by the World Bank as people living on $1.50 a day or less. And that, by the way, that's relative. So if you think about this, when you're like $1.50 a day, that goes really far in Southeast Asia. Well, no, it means $1.50 a day relative to U.S. economy. So imagine if you had to live for everything: housing, food, education, medical care, transportation, name it, entertainment. You had to live on $1.50 a day, full stop. That's what there are 1.4 billion people living like that around the world. And that's a pretty daunting statistic, something that if people have not been exposed to it or seen it abroad, have not gone to places where people live in abject poverty, understand how pervasive it is really tough to wrap your mind around. And I had lived as a young girl in Hong Kong with my family, and also in Russia right after the fall of communism, where they were in an economic depression. And I traveled, to places like Mexico and other places as a young child and like seeing some of that. But there was just this awareness that, it's just by the draw of life, the luck of life, where you're born and what family you're born into and what financial status and situation you inherit. And yes, we all can work and improve our status. And yes, there's the bootstraps concept in there, especially in a democracy where you can, improve your lot, hopefully with luck, the grace of God and a lot of hustle, a lot of grit. But at the end of the day, there are literally, 1 out of 5 children who die in certain districts of Cambodia because of having diarrhea, because they don't have clean water, drinking water. Or, there's children who die for a lack of a dollar vaccination, and these things these are criminal and they're man-made. Poverty is man-made. There's totally enough resources and abundance in the world for everyone to have their basic needs met. If you took the 100 wealthiest individuals on the planet and you took their wealth and redistributed it, you could end poverty instantly with the top 100 human beings. Could address that 1.4 billion to make sure that they're fitting above the poverty level, to just give context for how much we have, how much there is to go around. And so at the end of the day, we just believed in that vision that it was possible. We've seen countries like Rwanda. My amazing mentor, a gentleman named Joe Ritchie, I call him my Gandalf. He's truly so special. This man out of Chicago, businessman who created the board of economic development for Rwanda after the genocide, lifted their GDP by 12% in less than a decade. They went from total depression and economic ruin after that civil war to the economic leader of the continent of Africa, better financially off than South Africa. They're the economic star. And that happened in less than a decade. There are mechanisms to end extreme poverty. There are real tools, that can actually do this. Singapore is a brilliant example. You go to Singapore today, one of the most beautiful, clean, schmick cities you could ever visit. And it was not even in the 80s that they were in a third world state, so this is just very, this is just something we believe is possible, and people can think it's Pollyanna or trite, but we can prove it. We can show the mechanisms and the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations actually give the framework for how to end extreme poverty. And that's what we're trying to do. So, I think that was kind of where it all started. And then it began that we just used the technology of our generation, where we, instead of relying upon donations from the general public to write $30 checks, we use their voices as advocacy vehicle to get top-down commitments from governments and ultra-high-net-worth families and businesses. Because at the end of the day, as jaded as we get about politics sometimes, we are the employer of those, especially in a democracy like the U.S. We really are the boss of these politicians, and the people get to control the outcomes of, to the large part, where the political impact goes. That's how it's been designed, So we have done a lot of different hacks to try to get government to care, and they care if the people care. So we use their voices and to change the needle, to turn the needle, so to speak.
So in the very, very beginning, I mean, what type of, you mentioned that you'd lived in Hong Kong, you had lived in Russia, you had been to different places. What was it that, why had you been there? Was it for your parents' work or something? So you actually lived in these places for some time, and kind of where you had seen some of this type of poverty that you've been working on for so long?
Yes. My dad is an entrepreneur and was a broker of business deals, and he was a renegade. And when the free market opened up, and after the post-communist and era of Russia, my dad fled there as an entrepreneur for opportunity. And not a lot of American businessmen saw that early, and he was there. And same with Hong Kong, he was doing business there. And so it was just really by luck that I had that exposure, but it definitely shaped my worldview, truly made me a global citizen, I guess, as it were. And then I married an Australian. That helps, when you start to really make the world feel smaller,
Have you and Josh made that connection that you both lived in Hong Kong?
We did. And okay. I think we talked about that. Yeah, that's right. Because my family lived in Discovery Bay when I was, and this was in the 80s. So it was a long time ago. It's changed a lot.
Yep, it has. And that's That's what's so encouraging about this is you can see it. I mean, here in the US, we look back to 100 years ago and we say we've come a long way in 100 years. But as you were saying, you look at Singapore, Vietnam today, a lot of these countries that have traditionally been extremely poor and had problems with war and everything. It really is amazing how quickly they can turn around if there's the right attitude in the people and the right policies with the government.
Yeah, it's amazing what change can be enacted with the right mechanisms. It's really profound.
Yeah, so I was going to ask specifically, like with Singapore as that example, what are those mechanisms? What are those processes that have been put into place in the past 20 or 30 years that have allowed them to go from, where they were to where they are now? Obviously, that's a huge question. There's a lot of answers, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But what's the basic high level formula for somebody that knows nothing about, how to end poverty?
Yeah, the number one thing, I mean, there's 17 goals in the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations where they look at this kind of holistically, that if you address these targets, you'll have major impacts. So hunger, health, and well-being, which includes mental health, which is a really interesting subsubject, quality education, gender equality, clean water, affordable, clean energy, economic growth, and decent work opportunities, industry and innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities in general, so if people who are especially abled or people, minorities or whatnot, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate change, and water and like addressing clean water and also ocean life, life on land and taking care of, the animal life, and then peace and justice and so on. And then having really strategic partnerships for these goals, like for all of those, those 16 other goals kind of underpin all this. And I mean, that kind of sounds like everything, right? Like everything that humans could be impacted by, but all of them holistically, being addressed in their own spheres have like incredibly, powerful exponential results. But probably the most when it comes to what I've been learning from what they did in Rwanda with Joe Ritchie, the number one thing is the character of the leaders. So corruption is a really big part of it. And that was what Joe Ritchie saw in President Kagame in Rwanda, is that he met this head of state who cared more about his country than himself. And if in businesses, I think it's the same. Character is like a great indicator of like potential success, right? Because the trickle down of the culture and the kinds of things that individual will do that are right for everyone, right? Because they're something baked in them that is like a truly fortified in goodness, like, just has this abundance and will have great outcomes. So, I think that, hope is a massive part of this too. I think that, there are a bunch of things that you would think traditionally, if you were unsophisticated in philanthropy, that you would think would help, but actually hurt. Like something you could probably heard about teaching a man to fish versus giving them a fish, or enabling people and creating distortion in markets. For example, like you look at Haiti right after they had the major earthquake in the last decade, and there was more money poured in foreign aid that year than the entire country, averages for their entire GDP. So imagine that kind of disproportion in any situation, right? Like imagine if you just went to some college kid, like saving up money, their pennies to like, get by or whatever, and then you just threw more money than they earned in a year at them as like a gift. You know what I mean? Like that creates distortions in markets and creates all kinds of problems. So like there are all kinds of dependencies and problems about how people go about with aid and how we try to address things. The white savior complex you've probably heard of, these kinds of issues, and all that has to be taken into account when you try to address this stuff. It's complicated and messy because it's human. But at the end of the day, I think it's really about hope. It's about empowering people. It's about providing opportunity and support and emotionally being calibrated into whatever those needs are in a very personal way, not through policies and systems. And I think that all of that stuff is just really inspiring. You can see incredible results. One of the biggest things I think you can do to address poverty and a whole list of social ills, things like reincarceration and anti-recidivism, because, if you know anything about the prison system, if you end up there, you end up back there. Statistically, it's like really tragic what the trajectory is if you end up getting in trouble with the law. When it comes to homelessness, mental health, poverty, sexual abuse, human trafficking, a bunch of issues that I care about as a human being on this planet, they all can be solved further upstream by helping a child get into a permanent loving family through our foster care system domestically and internationally with orphans and vulnerable children who are institutionalized. By getting them into families who love them, you can basically avoid a cacophony of devastation. So funny that you asked that, because at the moment I'm working on a global project around this called Orphan Myth, which is exactly addressing that issue of getting vulnerable children into families that we believe they deserve that, and that it's one of the greatest things we can do for mankind is address that and not neglect that issue.
Yeah, did you say Orphan Myth? MYTH?
Yep. Yeah. Orphan Myth. It comes from the idea that there are a bunch of myths around the idea of orphan. For example, it's a movement, a meta campaign for the sector of orphan care reform. If you look at, for example, one of the great myths we're trying to dispel with this campaign is that 80% of orphans and orphanages actually have living parents. Most people would not know that. When you think of orphan in an orphanage, you think it's because they have no parents.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of children that are institutionalized internationally are done so because of poverty and because we as funders from the West are paying for those institutions. So these families living in abject poverty see it as like a boarding school solution. They can get 3 meals a day and an education, so they put them in these institutions. In more nefarious cases, these institutions, solicit these families and these kids and seek them out or find them or whatever for literally human trafficking purposes and abuse and all kinds of things. That's more rare. Most of these institutions are really benevolent, doing incredibly good things, trying their best to help meet the temporal needs of these kids, but it ends up turning into long-term warehousing. And longitudinal studies now show that the kids would be better off having 1 meal a day and no education and being with their families. The kids who grow up in an orphanage are 500 times more likely to commit suicide. 2 out of 5 of them have been sexually abused. 1 out of 4 of them will have PTSD. I mean, the statistics of what the trajectory is for them if they're not in a little loving family unit is really severe. And we actually, with our donor dollars and our behavior of supporting orphanages and institutions, the missions trips that churches do, or you go and volunteer, paint the walls and take a selfie and drop off teddy bears and all this stuff, you actually are having really unintended consequences and you're driving families apart. So imagine if you repurposed your donor dollar and instead spent it on organizations that are working on prevention so that families aren't separated, or reunification so they can go back to their families, or adoption in the case of, there's severe neglect and abuse or whatever, that it's not appropriate for the child to go back to their family. But ultimately, instead of treating the symptom with just meeting the temporal needs of these orphans, what if we focused our energy and money on treating the cause, which is that they need loving adults and a family for them to land. So this whole campaign we've got with 25 different charities in the sector who, whether domestically or addressing it for foster care, that's another one of the myths. We don't have orphans in America. That's a myth. We call those kids experiencing foster care. There are 400,000 kids in foster care in America, and 100,000 of those have been awarded full custody of the state they live in. In Utah, where I'm from, there are 300 orphans, quote unquote, foster kids who will never go back to their parents because of that parental right being terminated. And so that's another myth that we want to dispel. And my favorite myth of all that we're trying to address in this whole campaign and this initiative is that this problem can't be solved. Going back to, ending extreme poverty, there are actually more families globally around who would take in a child than there are children available, vulnerable children who don't have families. This is not a supply and demand issue. This is truly something we can solve. It's the bureaucracy and the systems and the approaches we've used that are fundamentally flawed. And so they estimate around 150 million kids around the world that need a mom and a dad. And all the research shows there are more people who would take them in or desperately want children, or their families want them back if they could have support with some of the issues of poverty and be reunified. So it's an issue we can actually solve together, which is really worthwhile. Yeah,
we the episode of the podcast actually that went live this morning is with a woman. Her name's she's a minister. Her name's Only Love Alston. She's in New York City. I think she lives in Brooklyn now, but she was a foster kid in the projects and when she was growing up in New York City, and she was taken away exactly what you're saying. She was taken away from her parents and it wasn't from what I gathered, it wasn't the right move, and I think she went into the state's custody and then it just really kind of like started this cycle. And so she's on anybody listening should go listen to that episode as well. She's going and starting. I mean, she's been an activist for a long time now in New York City, working on the ground and with, political leaders and whatever to really help continue to fix that system that's broken and that she was negatively affected by, where there's so much room for improvement. But you had said something, and this is kind of getting more maybe for the more cynical person out there, right? So I remember, and you brought up that Haiti example. When I was teaching social entrepreneurship, I did a lot of research on that specifically, and we use that as it's a case study that's brought up often. And I remember talking and watching, I can't remember what documentary it was. There was a documentary that used that as kind of its focal point as well. But basically after that, the earthquake hit Haiti and the destruction that was there. I mean, a good example is like so much rice was brought in by so many different nonprofits that it created an absolute basically monopoly in the market for rice, to where you could just go down and get free rice. And so nobody was willing to pay for rice. And so every rice farmer was put out of work, right? Like that's a good example of, that's right. It was intended to be a good deed and people gave their money and then, but it completely screwed up the economy and really turned things upside down. And then it also just goes to show human nature, whether we like it or not. All of us, if like you said, it's a great example. If I'm used to making $1 a day, but making $360 a year, but somebody comes to me and says, you know what, here's $100,000. Like, good luck. Mm-hmm. I don't have the tools, the resources, the knowledge, the skill set, anything, the education to be able to handle that. Right. Mm-hmm. And so chances are I'm going to blow it. There's a lot of cynical people out there, and you hear these negative case studies of some of these nonprofits and the other side of this is like these nonprofits that are actually paying executives a ton of money, and and so there's this negative connotation there. What's the real, like, if you're peeling the veil back, somebody who's been in this for so long, what's the reality? And then what questions should people ask? Where should they be looking in order to make good decisions when donating to causes that are actually going to make a big impact, to kind of help people check that box so that they're not worried about, well, I'm gonna give $20 and I bet 19 of it's only, going to go, some executive somewhere, that kind of negative mentality that is there for a reason, right? What's your take on that? And what advice do you have there?
Oh, thank you so much for letting me speak about that. It's interesting when you talked about somebody living on $1 a day and they're giving them $100,000. Funny enough, that this is a human thing, to your point. It's the human nature. It has nothing to do with people living in poverty. Oh, they just wouldn't know what to do with the money. In the U.S., somebody having middle income situation or even higher to middle income, if they win the lottery, I mean, any person winning the lottery, the statistic is 70% of the winners end up bankrupt within a few years of receiving that large financial windfall. So
there's also that big statistic totally with like professional athletes that come in and, they come in, they're 19 years old, they grew up in poverty, they get a contract for $100 million, they play for 3 years. Yeah. And then I think the statistic is like 70-something% of them are bankrupt 70%. Within a few years.
100%. Yeah. So that's 100% is 70%. Yeah. 70% of, So to your point, but your question about, the demonizing of overhead is something I'm super passionate about. Actually, I executive produced my first documentary that's in post-production at the moment. and it's called Uncharitable. And I can't wait for it to come out this spring. Stephen Gyllenhaal, Maggie and Jake Gyllenhaal's dad, is the director of our film. And we made the film. It's a 90-minute exploration of, if you all want to go on to TED Talk and watch Dan Pallotta's TED Talk called The Way We Think of Charity is Dead Wrong. It's one of the most influential paradigm shifting TED Talk in history. And that's not just my opinion. The curator of Steve Anderson of TED Talk actually says that in our documentary. And it's one of the most engaged with of all time. And it's millions of people have seen it. What Dan explores in that TED Talk, we do a 90-minute exploration in, and we in depth lay out the argument. He also has a book called Uncharitable. And basically, we're just addressing that false assumption that we believe is really archaic to demonize overhead. At the heart of the question of like paying people big salaries and like, what is the percentage of money that goes to the cause? Where that comes from is a really pure place, a need to avoid exploitation, right? We don't want someone saying they're doing good in the name of those suffering and then lining their own pockets and taking advantage. That's an appropriate thing to care about, and we should, because there are bad actors. Charity, I've learned in my years, and it's been heartbreaking for me, literally heartbreaking. It attracts like the best of mankind and the worst, like, because it's just so polarizing, the lens of which people come. They try to hide a multitude of sins, take advantage of people that are really good-hearted. But ultimately, in terms of the percentage issue, it doesn't tell the story. What percent of your overhead, that doesn't tell you anything about the utility of the impact. It doesn't tell you anything. If I were to use the analogy, if I were to do a bake sale, that's 0% overhead, and I raised $100 for people starving, great. Okay. That's fantastic. But what if I put on an event that cost $5 million, but had 60% overhead, or, 50% overhead, 2.5 million, but I raised 2.5 million, which do you think starving people would prefer? Right. Yeah. Or whatever issue, if I'm trying to address cancer, whatever it is. All of the mechanisms that we know in the free market and the for-profit market that work, all the mechanisms like paying the best talent, taking risk, investing into marketing, right? Like storytelling, brand identity, developing new leads, all of the stuff that we know. I mean, McDonald's spends something like $100 million to invest in kids buying Happy Meals, and it's like, so if you can invest in a community of consumption, we should be able to invest in a community of compassion. And all of these levers that we use, that it takes money to make money in business, we know work. They're like fundamental levers. We can't use them in the nonprofit world. And I even hate that it's called nonprofit. It should be for impact. I mean, Simon Sinek was just saying this the other day. I saw on this piece of content, and I love that. That's why my company is called Hadley Impact, our little boutique consultancy that helps, anyone with a one-stop shop of all these services. We do this. We're for profit. We are for impact, and we work with organizations that are trying to make a difference. Some of them have a tax status where there's no, where there's tax exemptions and they're considered a nonprofit, quote unquote. But, I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, you should be asking the question of what is the utility of this dollar? So if a huge percentage is going away, but over time I can end something like homelessness in America, which would you prefer? Do you want to address the biggest societal ills and devastating pain points with the cheapest available Band-Aid? Do you want us to get, find the people, the best people we can get, or do you want us to just find the best people to solve these problems? And if we want to have it keep going like molasses and not really solve, because the nonprofit sector has had zero growth in 30 years, 0% of GDP growth, zero innovation, it's not zero innovation, but very minimal relative to other sectors. And you see these exponential growth in these other verticals and with the technologies that are available because they use these levers, then yeah, let's keep doing what we're doing. But if you want to see a world where we actually end poverty, we make sure that a child doesn't die for a lack of a 50-cent vaccination. Let us use the levers that are available to humans and hire the best minds and the greatest people. And so that's basically, something we address. We show 4 or 5 of the greatest nonprofits in the last generation who were just in meteoric success, having incredible growth, investing into marketing and talent and taking risks and making really profound moves. and seeing unbelievable results. And then they were demonized in the media as like spending too much on overhead, which is not a very sophisticated narrative anyway, because literally a nonprofit can like change what overhead is literally by a pencil and an eraser, in paper. Like anyone's an accountant understands the sophistication of this, knows that it's all a farce, like it's a lie anyway. Like who do you think runs the programs? Who do you think, like, it takes money to pay the people to go do the things you have. So all of this is just such a disservice, I believe, to helping us achieve all of our goals. And I think I believe in how smart and bright our minds can be. We've changed our minds about civil rights. We've changed our minds about, smoking when you're pregnant. We've changed our minds about a lot of things as a society that we needed to. And I think this is going to be one of them. And that's why we made this documentary as a part of that effort to help people rethink the way they've thought of charity. So check out Dan's TED Talk and look out for our film when it comes out here in this, hopefully later spring. But yeah, Ed Norton's in the film and a lot of really high profile people from the nonprofit sector sharing this. So we're kind of saying it in voice of choirs, and hopefully we lay out the argument in a compelling enough way. It'll make you rethink the next time you go to donate, that that's not what you're asking. You look at what their dreams are. Do they have Google, Nike, Starbucks level dreams as a nonprofit? Because I don't care if you don't pay yourself overhead. If you're not effective whatsoever in addressing this issue, that doesn't mean you're good at what you do,
Man, I love that perspective. And it is true. There is such an oversimplification, which leads to people probably being less generous, because it's easy to oversimplify and say, oh, and again, that narrative has been, for one reason or another, and maybe it's just me, but it sounds like more than just me, has had this narrative of like, well, a lot of these are just big corporations that are just paying themselves a bunch of money. You shouldn't, it's a waste of your money to give it to them, whatever. Like, not that you shouldn't be doing other things, giving your time and service and, service and community or whatever, but to hear the perspective from you who's been in the trenches, that, and I can't wait to see the documentary. You said uncharitable, is that what it's called?
Uncharitable. Yeah. Uncharitable.
Cool. There was one other thing I was going to ask about that. Oh, well, doesn't matter. Okay. So, you still have maybe 10 or 15 minutes?
Yeah. So yeah, I have two. I think that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I want to be sensitive to your time, but I got a couple other questions that I want to make sure we touch on. So tell me about, it's been a crazy year. I don't know how many times I've heard that in the past. I've heard so many people say that. I hate to be the add to that, but there's been a lot going on, and I know you've been busy, and I specifically saw quite a bit about the charity that you did, and it was called, is it One World Together? Was that? No. Sorry. How are you really? Sorry. How are you really? That's
how are you really? Oh yeah.
So tell me about the how are you really, and some of the approaches that, with that one, and then any other of the events that you've been a part of through COVID, having to really pivot, where you've been, a lot of what you've done has been, as you've put it, building tribes by bringing people together and putting on these concerts. You've had to really pivot, and you guys have done some really creative things with some of the things that you're involved with. Through COVID and doing it the way you have. So tell me a little bit more about the how are you really, and some of the things that you guys have done, and then also what that was all about, or is all about.
Yeah, on how are you really, and before the pandemic hit in January during Sundance, Kenneth Cole reached out to me, the amazing designer, and asked me and Hadley Impact to come on and help him with his new initiative called the Mental Health Coalition, which was this kind of convener model meta campaign, like what I just described, an orphan myth, what global citizen is. Hadley Impact has put in the 10,000 hours to be considered global experts in this, what we call trans-organizational collaboration, or the convener model meta campaigning. What that really means is we just get charities to all espouse the same messaging and content at the same time and saturate the marketplace. So like a rising tide, we can have all boats come up. Basically, charities are often viciously competing for limited resources and having a lot of redundancy in their advocacy, awareness, marketing efforts, fundraising efforts. And we get them to be a choir singing in one voice, and we play like the proverbial choir director. And so designing these meta campaigns is a big part of what we do. And ultimately, Kenneth had, I had known his beautiful daughter, Amanda Cole. And so anyway, they reached out to us, we met, and we talked about his hopes to address mental health And then the pandemic hit, and we were in discussions with like, what he was trying to build. And then it just put kind of jet fuel behind his passion of trying to do that, because they saw like, I think a third more inbound calls to crisis text hotline for suicidality and suicidal ideation from after the pandemic, with quarantine and anxiety and, losing jobs and despair and loss of hope and everything you guys have talked about with your podcast. And so Kenneth said, can we, address, can we bring you on now and help out with, launching this campaign? We're going to do a campaign. And the idea was called How Are You Really? And it's really, we ask people every day, how are you? And we say, we're good, right? But oftentimes we're not good. So the question is, how are you really? Like, be vulnerable, really answer that question and make it okay to destigmatize having poor mental health or be struggling or whatever. And so we launched that at the beginning of the year in March, and we had it was a huge success. We have 30 plus charities, from NAMI to Trevor Project to Crisis Text Hotline to Harvard Psychology Department. I mean, we had all these charities partner, and we got a lot of A-list celebrities to be a part of that campaign. It was a social media campaign, because the main thing was for destigmatization and awareness. And so we had Kylie Jenner and Justin Bieber and Deepak Chopra and Whoopi Goldberg and Sarah Bareilles and dozens of other, Donna Karen, other celebrities all participated. And they posted on their social, how are you really, to their fans. And they shared vulnerably how their mental health was going and struggled their lived experience, if they had any, or if they had a loved one who had, and just allowed it to be destigmatized, which is something Kenneth did a remarkable job for HIV and AIDS in the 90s. I mean, he was the first cause marketer, truly, that we're aware of. Like, he was the first brand to actually build marketing and ad campaigns around the HIV pandemic. And so he's a legend and a pioneer in this issue of, destigmatization and helping with awareness and using his brand and platform to do good. So we ended up reaching 600 million people in 4 days. And whether it was like a billboard in Times Square or, an interview on Good Morning America or CNN, on thousands and thousands of people to participate in the campaign. And we raised $250,000 from a corporate sponsor. Amazing app called Lyft. It's an amazing mental health app that you guys, if any of you, even if you're just maintaining your mental health, let alone if you're struggling, is an incredible utility that's free. You can have paid additional features, but it's an amazing app. Not like Lyft that, like Uber, but it's the Lyft app for mental health. The Recovery Suites app, there's a few of them, and that's one of them. So anyway, ultimately, it was something I felt really honored to be a part of and proud of, and really grateful for people like Kenneth and how they use their platform for good. So thanks for asking about that.
Yeah. I mean, man, I feel like Josh said at the very beginning, we could keep going. I'm sure you've got 100 other stories that I'd love to hear and other things you're working on. But tell me right now about the consulting work that you're doing. It's Hadley Impact Consulting, right? So how does that work, and what is the approach that you have now? I mean, is that it? It's, somebody like Kenneth Cole or whoever reaches out and then you help formulate the entire plan from beginning to end for these fundraisers, or what exactly are you doing on that side?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Corey. So Hadley Impact is a boutique consultancy that's a one-stop shop for social good. So we do everything from strategy, fundraising, campaigning, creative, event production, not so much this last year, right? But we do, PR. I mean, literally anything you can think of to help amplify the good you're doing, we can come help. And we're like this little special forces group that can come and help. So yeah, oftentimes we'll get a phone call from someone and say, I want to start something. We are really great at activating because we're a jack of all trades. You can totally accuse us of being a master of none. And I think that's fair. We punch way above our weight for fundraising for startups. Like, we definitely bring in resources with concepts that, that it's really hard when it's the hardest to bring money in. And we do that really, really, really well. We are global experts in that convener model, like I mentioned, the meta campaigning. That I would say we are experts in and have really mastered that craft. But there's, but the other stuff, there's better PR firms, there's better creatives, there's better event producers, right? Like, we often bring them in under us and sub them out. But the fact that we know how to do it makes us real utility to our clients. So we're fluent in marketing, nonprofit, and in entertainment. And so that's pretty rare to find people that are trilingual in those three areas. And that's brought a lot of value to our clients. And then the fact that we're a little agency allows us to wax and wane with the needs of the clients. So, if they need to get something started, then later they can hire in-house executives. We do that. So in the case of the, How Are You Really campaign, we were helping any way we could with getting, influencers or PR. But our main request in that instance was to help with the fundraising and finding, financial partners to help execute on it. So there's really depends on the scope of work and what we do. I've never, ever done any kind of marketing, outbound marketing to ever get business. It's all been word of mouth and inbound. And I'm super grateful for that. And we're very, very busy and we feel really, really grateful we can, take it on about what we can, but we're trying to look at some new ways. I've been really inspired by Josh and his platform and what he's created. And this year in 2021, my business partner, Jackie, and I are planning on taking some of the, amazing knowledge and the incredible experts that we have in our ecosystem and creating like training tools that would be, courses and virtual stuff that would be digital so that it could be done more at scale. Our minimum retainer is around $15,000 a month. And so, that kind of makes us out of the ballpark for a lot of startup nonprofits. A lot of our clients are multinational corporations or major NGOs or ultra high net worth family offices and celebrities. Those are mostly our clients that can afford that. So we want to make it so that it's accessible. Like, what if we could create some of the training and insights that we've gained and bring in some of, like I said, the incredible talent that we know and create modules that a nonprofit could pay $50 to learn instead of putting us on a retainer to come and teach all that to them. So that's something we're looking at to kind of scale and give some of the insight and intellectual property that we think is great value. That's something we're looking to do this year. So Josh, I'll have to be talking to you more about your services on that to help us to grow that endeavor.
For sure. I'm listening to you. I'm like, man, this is the type of stuff that we want to be doing with our agency. We would love to partner up on some of this stuff.
Awesome. I'd love that. Let's do it.
Yeah, I know. As you've been talking, because the conversation Josh and I had as we were just doing some 2020 planning. So the end of 2019 was that we wanted to work with more hope brands. That's what, we wanted to find, because, we're a marketing agency, but that's, we're trying to do our part in any way we can to make the world a better place. And so as big of a goal as that sounds like, or maybe as cliche as it sounds, but as we've been seeking out these hope brands, these brands that are providing some level of hope to the world in their own way, those doors start to open up. And so, keep us posted if there's anything we can do to help. I'd love to collaborate. As far as mindset and kind of where your head's at and what you're trying to do, that's stuff that our entire team loves, and Josh and I especially. So, that'd be fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much.
Yeah. I want to leave it there, man. Lindsay, you are inspiring, and I normally we go into a lot, like our conversations normally start with, tell us about your upbringing. We want to hear, more about, we touched on that a little bit, but the reason that I didn't is because I wanted to try to get into as much of the stuff that you've done in the last 15 years as possible. And we've barely scratched the surface. So we really appreciate your time. It has been
thank you guys.
Pleasure. And I look forward to everybody hearing this, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Awesome, you guys. Thanks so much. Really appreciate you.
Yeah. Aloha. Have a great time in Hawaii. Say hi to her.
Aloha. Take care. Bye-bye.
Right, thanks, Lindsay. Bye-bye.
Hello, it's Corey here, and I just want to thank you so much for listening into the Hope Strategy Podcast. I hope you're enjoying it as much as we are enjoying having these amazing conversations with these incredible individuals talking about hope. We'd love it if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing, and leaving us a review on iTunes or Spotify or anywhere that you listen to your podcasts, and share it with anybody you feel that can benefit from these messages of hope. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy Podcast.